I pressed my face into the backseat window, crying so hard I barely noticed him pull the car over and knock gently on the glass, his voice soft through the rain. "Hey, you don't have to be alone tonight." Something about the warmth in his tone stopped me mid-sob. It wasn't just his words, it was the way his voice carried an unspoken understanding, like he could see straight into the corners of my heart that no one else had ever bothered to notice, let alone care about. Every jagged breath I took seemed to slow, caught between the panic of my own tears and the strange, steady pull of his calm. My hands flew to my face, pressing against my cheeks, my jaw, as if I could physically hold myself together, keep the pieces from falling apart right there on the sidewalk in the middle of a city that never slept, never paused, never waited for anyone, not even me. Every honk of a distant car horn, every rumble of tires over wet asphalt, every hiss of brakes seemed magnified, sharper, echoing through me like the city itself was emphasizing just how alone I had been. Like the universe had conspired to make me feel small, broken, exposed. And yet, his voice cut through it all. I wiped my cheeks hastily, unsure if I should even answer. I wanted to say nothing. To disappear back into the dark folds of my jacket and pretend I wasn't trembling so violently. My hands shook uncontrollably. My chest heaved. My pulse thrummed painfully in my ears, a wild rhythm that betrayed every ounce of fear and confusion inside me. And still, when I looked at him, I saw something that made my fingers, nearly frozen around the door handle, loosen just enough to allow me to slide it open. My fingers lingered there, hesitating. The metal was cold under my fingertips, slick with rain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that sliding the door open would be the first decision to shift everything, the first step into a world I wasn't prepared to navigate but was already, somehow, craving. The thought made my stomach twist. The thought made my chest ache with anticipation. The thought made me want to run and collapse all at once. I choked on the words, my voice cracking in a way that made me feel utterly ridiculous, entirely exposed, like he was going to see all of me, the trembling, the tears, the shaky vulnerability, and recoil and disappointment. But he didn't. He didn't flinch. He didn't judge. He didn't break the fragile bubble that I was offering him. He just waited. His eyes, steady, warm, patient, held me in a way that made me want to collapse into them, to let go of everything I had tried to keep tightly under control. There was a patience in him that seemed impossible, like the kind of patience found in quiet rooms where sunlight falls lazily across wooden floors, where time itself pauses just to let someone breathe, really breathe, without shame or fear. "It's okay," he said. The words were soft, low, gentle. "Sit. Let's get you home safe." That was all it took. A single, small act of kindness, a few simple words, a tilt of his head, the almost imperceptible hum in his voice, pulled me back from the edges of my unraveling. My shoulders, which had been locked tight in panic, softened fractionally. My hands, still trembling, released the door handle and slid into the seat, letting the world close in around me for just a moment. I climbed into the back seat, my body still shaking, my heart still hammering. The familiar leather of the seat smelled faintly of him, a mixture of coffee, something comforting, something warm that made my chest ache in a way I didn't understand. My nose caught the subtle, lingering scent, and I felt a strange ache, a pull I couldn't place, a need I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I didn't notice the rain at first, didn't even register the tiny drops sliding down the windows like delicate tears the city itself seemed to be shedding. Then I did. The pitter-patter against the car roof, the slick streets reflecting halos of streetlights, the occasional blur of a passing car, it all seeped into me slowly, forcing me to notice the world again. But for once, the outside chaos felt distant, irrelevant. The storm outside was loud, relentless, but inside the small metal cocoon of his car, there was silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Not fake safety, not the temporary illusion you cling to when the world is too loud. But real, tangible, warm safety, the kind that comes when someone sees all of you and doesn't look away. I kept my gaze fixed on the back of his head, noticing every subtle movement, the tilt of his neck, the way his fingers gripped the wheel, the faint curve of his jaw beneath the soft glow of the dashboard lights. And my chest tightened at the thought that this stranger, this man who had only ever been my Uber driver, had somehow become more than just a face in my night. He had become my anchor. I could feel my mind wandering, drifting dangerously, to thoughts I wasn't supposed to indulge in. Thoughts of what it might feel like to reach out and touch him, to let my hand brush his, to lean closer than was appropriate. Thoughts of what it would mean if I allowed myself to fall, not just into his car, but into him, completely, without reservation. I hated that I was thinking this. Hated that my pulse jumped every time he hummed softly along with the music playing from the speakers. Hated that I noticed the faint scent of his jacket again, the subtle warmth in his posture, the reassuring way his eyes occasionally flicked to the mirror to check on me, even when I was pretending to stare out the window. And yet, I couldn't stop. Every nerve in my body seemed alive with the knowledge that something had shifted. Something that I hadn't anticipated, something that went beyond safety, beyond comfort. A pull had formed between us, delicate, dangerous, undeniable. I remembered the first night I had cried in the back of his car, thinking no one would ever care enough to notice. And now I realized that he did care. That his patience, his gentle words, the smallest gestures, had built a bridge to a place I had long stopped believing existed. A place where my walls could fall down just enough to let someone in without the fear of being broken. And yet, fear still lingered. I told myself to breathe. To sit still. To focus on the road ahead. To remind myself that he was just being kind. That this wasn't anything more than a safe ride home after a bad night. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that every heartbeat, every glance, every soft word was pulling me closer to a truth I wasn't ready to admit, that I didn't just need this ride. I didn't just need his kindness. I didn't just need someone to help me survive the storm. I needed him. I leaned back against the seat, trying to make sense of the way my chest tightened, the way my stomach fluttered, the way my hands continued to tremble even though nothing had happened, nothing had been said, nothing had been promised. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer, fears I didn't want to face. Why am I like this? Why him? Why now? He glanced at me again, his eyes soft, warm, steady. The faintest quirk of a smile tugged at his lips, subtle, almost imperceptible, and I felt my chest lurch. My pulse jumped, my breath caught, and for a moment, I could have sworn the world had narrowed to nothing but the space between us, the quiet hum of the car, the rain sliding down the windows. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, gentle. Almost like he was asking not just about my immediate state, but about every fracture, every bruise, every hidden ache I carried inside me. I swallowed hard, forcing a nod, but it was weak. Unconvincing. And he noticed. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said softly, almost whispering, "but I'm here if you do." And something in me cracked open, just enough to let a single, jagged truth escape, that I had been so lonely, so unseen, so invisible for so long, and here was someone who made me feel like I mattered. Like I wasn't just surviving, I was seen, acknowledged, held, in the quietest, most profound way imaginable. The rain continued to fall, and the city lights shimmered like liquid gold on the slick streets. Each drop tapped against the car roof, each reflection blurred into soft halos, and I felt a strange, aching serenity. I was shaking, yes, but not just from fear. From anticipation, from longing, from the raw, undeniable pull that had formed between us. I didn't notice the time passing. I didn't notice the wet clothes sticking to my skin, or the chill creeping through the small gaps in my coat. I only noticed him. His presence, steady and unassuming, drawing me into a space where nothing outside mattered. Where the storm, both outside and inside me, could exist, but I wouldn't break. And somewhere deep inside, I realized that this night, this ride, this stranger, had already begun to change everything. At first, I told myself it was practical. I requested his ride every evening because I was too fragile to face the world alone, too exhausted from carrying around a life that seemed to demand perfection from me while offering nothing in return. The days had begun to blur into one another, each indistinguishable from the last. Work had been relentless, emails stacking in my inbox like jagged pieces of glass, deadlines pressing on my chest with a weight I could barely lift. My relationships, once my safe spaces, were unraveling thread by thread, worn thin by misunderstanding, exhaustion, and my own inability to reach out. The nights felt impossibly long, stretching past midnight, past 2 a.m., until I was left alone in my apartment with the echo of my own thoughts and the suffocating certainty that no one else cared enough to notice. His car became my temporary refuge. It was small, mundane in every other way, but within it, I felt like I had discovered a private sanctuary. The hum of the engine vibrated gently beneath me, low and steady, almost meditative, like a lullaby that only existed for me. The soft city lights reflected off his profile in the rearview mirror, casting delicate shadows that made his face look warmer, softer than I ever could have imagined. He let me choose the music sometimes, quiet, simple songs that didn't demand attention but filled the silence just enough. I began to notice everything about him, the way his hands gripped the wheel, calm and precise, but with a subtle tension that suggested he was always thinking, always alert. The way his thumb would tap lightly against it when he was concentrating, almost like a rhythm only he could hear. The quiet way his voice could fill the space between us without a single harsh word. It wasn't just kindness, it was a presence, a constancy that my soul had been starved for without even realizing it. And somehow, against every rule I'd made for myself, my heart started noticing him. I hated it. I hated how much I wanted him. I hated that I found myself looking for his car in the late evening, scanning the streetlights and the dim glow of headlights, counting the minutes until I could hear his voice again, until the dashboard lights revealed the curve of his jaw, the faint tension in his shoulders, the small imperfections that made him feel real and human. I hated that a simple good evening made my chest flutter as though it were capable of breaking entirely, as though my ribs could shatter with the force of wanting someone so desperately yet so impossibly. I hated that his concern, so small, so unassuming, was slowly unraveling every careful boundary I had built around myself, every wall that I had spent years constructing to protect a fragile, bruised heart. We never talked about why I had been crying that first night. Maybe he sensed it was mine to reveal when I was ready, maybe he understood that some grief couldn't be named, couldn't be placed neatly into words that anyone else could comprehend. Perhaps he recognized the jagged edges of someone who had been bruised and battered by life in ways that weren't visible on the surface, the quiet despair that existed behind eyes that smiled when the world wasn't looking. But every word after that night felt like therapy. Every ride became a story we were slowly writing together, a narrative stitched from small confessions, quiet moments, the soft, unspoken bond of two people inhabiting the same confined space yet finding their own safe universes within it. "Rough day?" he'd ask sometimes, voice soft, almost hesitant, from the rearview mirror. "Want to talk about it?" And each time, I'd hesitate. My throat would tighten, the words heavy and jagged in my chest, lodged somewhere between the ache of wanting to confide and the terror of exposure. But eventually, I did. I spoke about the little humiliations, the daily defeats, the moments that left me feeling like I was collapsing inward without anyone noticing. I spoke about things that I didn't even fully understand myself, moments that felt messy and unnameable, the kind of things that leave you raw and trembling when you think about them too long. And he listened. Not with pity. Not with false cheerfulness, the kind that made you feel worse by reminding you that no one else truly cared. But with a quiet intensity that made me feel heard, that made the edges of my brokenness soften just enough to breathe again. There was a depth to his attention, a subtle calibration in the tilt of his head, the brief pause before he responded, the way he let silence fill the gaps long enough for me to collect my thoughts but not long enough for the moment to break. I began noticing things I shouldn't. The small furrow of his eyebrows when he was concentrating, the faint tension in his jaw when he stayed silent for longer than necessary, the almost imperceptible catch in his voice when he asked if I'd eaten dinner. These weren't grand gestures, not the kind that make someone fall in love at first sight. They were minor, everyday observations, but they burned themselves into my awareness. They made my chest tighten, made my stomach turn with longing, made me realize that I had begun to inhabit the same small orbit as him in ways I didn't fully comprehend. Sometimes, I'd stare out the window, pretending I wasn't watching him in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, trying to convince myself that I wasn't falling, that I wasn't giving away pieces of myself with every shared silence, every fleeting glance. The city blurred past, lights and reflections like tiny galaxies rushing by, and I'd wonder, why am I like this? Why did someone I barely knew, someone who was technically a stranger, make me feel safer than my own apartment ever had? Why did my pulse jump every time he asked if I was okay? Why did a slight furrow in his brow make me ache with need I couldn't rationalize? And sometimes, in those moments, I caught myself imagining things I wasn't supposed to. Little daydreams, harmless at first, that became something more dangerous over time. I pictured leaning across the console just to hear his voice closer. I imagined my hand brushing against his on the wheel. I imagined saying something, anything, that would let him know I wasn't just another passenger, another fleeting presence in his evening, but someone whose world had shifted entirely because of him. But then I'd catch myself. The rational part of me would flare up in warning. No. Stop. You don't know him. You barely know him. And yet, that part of me, the hungry, desperate part, didn't care. It didn't listen. It whispered back, but he's here. And he sees you. And maybe that's enough for now. And every evening, as I sank into the back seat, as the city lights stretched past, as the rain tapped gently against the roof, I realized that he had become a kind of gravity in my life. Subtle, gentle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. A force I could not resist, no matter how hard I tried. I hated myself for it. Hated that my thoughts were no longer my own. Hated that my evenings, once solitary, had become dependent on his presence. Hated that a few words, a few gestures, had dismantled all the careful rules I had made to protect myself. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when every fiber of me, every quiet, desperate piece of my heart, had started to anchor itself to him. I hated how much I wanted him. He had a presence that didn't scream, but it filled every space it touched. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't overbearing, but it was undeniable. It was the kind of presence that quietly carved a space in your chest, one you didn't realize was empty until someone sat there and made you feel at home for the first time in forever. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized that I was addicted to that presence. Not in a shallow, fleeting way, not because he was perfect, or charming in the way that made you swoon on paper, but because he offered something no one else had ever been able to, a space where I didn't have to hide, where I didn't have to pretend I was okay when I wasn't, where the world's chaos dulled just enough to let me breathe, to let me be human. I would never have admitted it aloud, even to myself at first. I told myself it was practical. He was safe. His car, with a tum of tires over wet asphalt, its faint leather scent, its soft, dim dashboard light, was a refuge. But gradually, the reasons became less about practicality and more about necessity. It wasn't just a ride home anymore, it was a place where I could exhale, a place that slowly began to feel like it belonged to me, like he belonged to me in the smallest, most dangerous ways. One evening, the rain hammered harder against the windows, drumming a steady rhythm that matched the nervous pounding of my heart. I was quiet, staring at the blurred city lights outside, trying to focus on anything other than the warmth of his arm near the steering wheel, the low, steady vibration of his voice as he hummed softly along with the song playing on the radio. My fingers gripped the edge of the seat, nails biting into the leather, and I felt my stomach twist in a way I didn't fully understand. The sound of the rain was hypnotic, almost meditative, but it couldn't mask the pounding of my pulse, or the subtle, creeping awareness of how much I wanted to reach out and close the distance between us. "You've been quiet," he said after a while, turning slightly to glance at me in the mirror. His eyes were patient, probing, like he was waiting for me to decide whether to tell him everything or nothing at all. There was an almost dangerous stillness in his gaze, a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavier, thicker, like something was about to shift in ways I couldn't predict. "I'm just tired," I whispered, my voice breaking a little despite my efforts to keep it steady. "Not that kind of tired," he murmured, voice low and careful, almost as if he were revealing a secret to the night itself. "The kind that comes from carrying too much alone." The words sliced through me like a knife softened with velvet. I swallowed hard, trying not to tremble. They named something I hadn't been able to admit even to myself. The kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by sleep or food or distractions, the kind that sits in your chest like a heavy stone, pressing you into the floor, pressing you into your own skin, making the world seem impossibly distant and impossible to face. "I know the feeling," I admitted quietly, my voice almost a whisper against the rain. "Of pretending everything's fine when it's not. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers, the rain drumming on the roof, the occasional distant hum of a passing car. And then, softly, almost as if afraid to break the fragile spell between us, he said, "Maybe that's why we're here right now. Maybe that's why we found each other tonight." I glanced at him in the mirror, my pulse spiking, my breath catching. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken, something dangerous in its quiet intensity. It made me shiver in a way I wasn't entirely ready for. It made me want to lean forward, to close the distance between us, to reach across the small divide and let my hand brush against his. I forced my eyes back to the passing city, heart hammering, telling myself over and over, "No. You can't. You shouldn't. This isn't real." And yet, I didn't stop requesting his ride. The next night. And the night after. Each evening, the same ritual, the same quiet, lingering anticipation. I told myself it was only for comfort. Only for safety. Only because I was too fragile to face the world alone. But the more nights I spent in that car, the more I realized that his presence had become a quiet necessity. Not just because it was safe, not just because it was comforting, but because I found myself craving him in ways I didn't understand, in ways that made my chest ache and my pulse race and my stomach twist into knots I couldn't untangle. I noticed the smallest details, the faint crease in his forehead when he was thinking, the subtle way his jaw clenched when he held back a comment, the softness in his voice when he asked if I'd eaten dinner, the quiet rhythm of his breath that somehow seemed to synchronize with mine. Every glance at the rearview mirror revealed new little quirks I had somehow memorized, a dangerous intimacy forming without a single word spoken. I realized that I could identify the exact moment he shifted in his seat, or the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly after a long day, or the way his lips barely curved in a smile when he didn't think I was watching. It was terrifying, and exhilarating, and addictive. Sometimes, I would pretend to stare out the window, but my eyes betrayed me. I was watching him, always. Watching the subtle gestures, the faint shadows that moved with him in the dim light, the way his fingers tapped against the steering wheel, almost in rhythm with my own heartbeat. The city blurred past, a river of lights, reflections, rain-slicked streets, and I would think, why am I like this? Why do I feel this way for someone I barely know? Someone who is technically a stranger? And yet, the answer was obvious. I craved him. Not for safety alone, not for comfort alone, but because he made me feel alive in ways I had long stopped feeling. He made me feel seen, recognized, and acknowledged. My pulse quickened at the sound of his voice. My stomach twisted at the warmth of his smile. My hands trembled at the thought of speaking the words I wanted him to hear, but never did. Some nights, the rain was heavier, drumming like a steady percussion against the roof. Other nights, it was lighter, like a whisper, a secret meant only for the two of us. And every night, without fail, my anticipation built, coil after coil, until the moment I slid into the backseat was electric with tension. I hated that I needed him. Hated that my evenings depended on his presence. Hated that I found myself counting the minutes until I could feel his presence again, until I could hear the faint hum of the engine, until the faint glow of the dashboard lights revealed his face. And yet, I couldn't stop. Each night felt like a small rebellion, a tiny surrender to something I didn't fully understand but could no longer resist. His quiet patience, his unspoken attentiveness, the small, delicate way he let me exist in my mess without comment or judgment, every bit of it drew me in closer. And I hated that I was so vulnerable to it, hated that I wanted it, hated that a part of me was starting to depend entirely on his presence to feel grounded, to feel safe, to feel like myself again. And still, the danger in it, the unspoken tension, the lines we weren't supposed to cross, the thrill of wanting someone who was technically off limits, made my pulse spike in ways I couldn't rationalize. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was harmless. But every glance in the rearview mirror, every small smile, every carefully measured word chipped away at my defenses. I hated it. And I loved it. And sometimes, just sometimes, I caught him staring. Not openly, not in a way that was meant to be obvious, but in that quiet, almost imperceptible way that made my stomach tighten as if my body had recognized something my mind hadn't yet admitted. Just a fraction of a second, enough for me to feel the heat rise to my cheeks, enough for my pulse to spike like a drumbeat in the silence of the car. Then, just as quickly, he turned his gaze back to the road, as if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't shifted for that split second, as if I hadn't been caught in a storm of longing and confusion that left my hands trembling on my lap. And yet, those fleeting moments lingered longer than they should have. Something unspoken passed between us in the shadows of that glance, something heavy and charged, something that made the air thicker, the nights darker, the rain pattering against the windows more intimate, more insistent. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, settling there like a secret I wasn't supposed to know, like a warning and an invitation all at once. Every ride became a negotiation between fear and desire. Between the need to protect my fragile, fractured heart and the reckless urge to surrender it entirely. I hated how much I wanted him. Hated it with a fierceness I didn't expect. And yet, I couldn't stop. I found myself leaning into the tiny conversations we shared, the quiet silences that weren't awkward but somehow sacred, the brief touches of his hand when he handed me a tissue, or adjusted the mirror so he could see me better when I was crying, or simply offered me a smile that made my chest ache. I began imagining what it would be like if this wasn't temporary. If this wasn't just an Uber ride at the end of another long, terrible day. If this presence, this quiet, constant, magnetic force, was real. And with each passing night, those thoughts grew louder, more insistent, until I realized with a jolt that the lines I had drawn for myself, lines meant to protect me, meant to keep me safe, were already blurring, dissolving like salt in rainwater. I started to speak. Slowly, carefully, testing the waters, feeling the weight of each word before it left my lips. At first, my words came out in stutters, uneven, fragile, like glass that might shatter if handled too roughly. I wasn't used to letting someone see the parts of me I'd carefully hidden away, the raw ache of my loneliness, the endless worry that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, the nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if the world had forgotten I existed. And yet, somehow, he listened. Not in the impatient way that people often do, nodding along while secretly glancing at their phones, counting the minutes until they could escape the conversation. Not in a superficial way that offered temporary comfort but no real connection. He listened with a quiet intensity that made me feel like the entire universe had condensed into that car, into that single, fragile moment, and that my entire flawed, trembling self, was all that mattered. The little smiles he gave when I laughed despite myself. The subtle curve of his lips when a story slipped out funny instead of sad. The way his eyes would follow mine when I wasn't looking, holding me in a gaze that was patient and insistent all at once. I couldn't escape the pull. Every glance, every shift of his posture, every subtle tilt of his head felt intentional, as if he were mapping the edges of me, memorizing the fragile terrain of my heart, marking it as important without ever saying a word. I hated it. I hated that my pulse jumped whenever his gaze lingered too long. I hated that my stomach twisted in anticipation every time I heard him ask softly, "Rough day?" I hated that I wanted him to notice me even more, even when I knew I shouldn't. I hated that I was losing control, that I was letting someone who had started as a stranger become the axis around which my evenings rotated, the quiet obsession I couldn't name but couldn't resist. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, it happened. It was a night much like any other. The streets glistened with rain, slick and reflective, turning every streetlight into a blurred halo, painting the world in golds and whites and the kind of soft oranges that made the city feel intimate and secretive. The hum of the tires over the wet asphalt was steady, comforting, and I had expected nothing more than the quiet sanctuary I had come to rely on. I climbed into the car, the scent of his jacket, coffee, cedar, something faintly spicy, making my chest tighten in a way I had grown accustomed to. I expected comfort. I expected him. I expected safety. But I didn't expect her. Another girl, leaning too close, brushing against his arm in a way that made my chest seize, my stomach twist violently, my pulse pound like it wanted to escape my ribs entirely. She laughed at something he said, her hand lingering on his forearm, a gesture that made me want to shrink into myself, disappear from the world entirely. I froze, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the edge of the seat. She asked to sit in front, he said quickly, catching the change in my expression, the flicker of panic I couldn't mask. I told her to wait outside, but she smirked at me, her eyes sharp, knowing. He's cute, isn't he? My chest burned. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat, twisted with fear and jealousy and something I didn't have a name for yet. I should walk away. I should turn, leave, protect the fragile heart that had been so carefully stitched together over the weeks. But I couldn't. My body betrayed me. I stayed. I watched. I hated that I stayed. When she left, and the sound of her heels faded into the wet street, he turned to me, his voice low, steady, and yet there was a vulnerability there that made me want to reach for him, to press myself against him and beg him not to leave me alone in the world. She's no one, he said, his voice soft but firm, resonating through the small space of the car. You're the one I want. Every fiber of me ached to believe him. To trust him. To let myself fall entirely, fully, without reservation. My pulse thundered, my chest ached, and yet I found myself hesitating, wary of the cracks I might expose if I surrendered too quickly. And then, the twist. His phone buzzed. A message from his brother, she found out. Don't bring her here. It's not safe. My heart dropped like a stone in a dark well. I swallowed hard, voice trembling. Who? He swallowed, hard enough that I saw the faint tension in his jaw, a line I hadn't noticed before. My ex, he admitted, voice tight. She's unstable. I didn't want to scare you. Fear and longing collided in a mess that left me dizzy. So I'm just another problem? I whispered, barely audible over the rain. No, he said, voice cracking just slightly, a raw edge that made my chest ache in ways I hadn't anticipated. You're the only thing that makes me breathe. I stepped up that night, unable to face him fully, unable to navigate the chaos that came with loving someone whose life was fractured, whose world was messy in ways I couldn't control. I wanted to trust him, wanted to stay, wanted to lean into the pull that had become my lifeline, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not when the stakes suddenly felt too high, when the lines between safe and dangerous, love and vulnerability, desire and caution, had blurred beyond recognition. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The next evening, I found myself walking toward the same street corner, heart hammering, pulse in overdrive, despite knowing that everything had shifted. Despite knowing that the delicate balance we had built was now fractured, tainted with the threat of someone else, with the weight of danger and secrecy. I hated how much I wanted him. And I hated how much I didn't care about the risks anymore. The world seemed to slow. Every droplet of rain hitting the windshield became deafening. Every reflection of light, every distant honk, every whisper of the wind, it all faded except for the sight of her. My hands shook. My breath caught. My pulse raced in a rhythm I couldn't control. She asked to sit in front, he said quickly, noticing my expression. I told her to wait outside, but his voice trailed, unsure, almost guilty. Almost. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat had closed up. My hands gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white, as I stared at him. And then she smirked at me. That careless, knowing, she knows what she's doing smirk. He's cute, isn't he? The words hit me like fire. My chest burned. My vision blurred with a combination of rage and heartbreak and something I couldn't name. Jealousy wasn't just a feeling, it was a force, a physical weight pressing down on me, pushing me into panic, making me feel exposed, ridiculous, weak. I whispered to myself, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding in my ears, I should walk away, so why can't I? I wanted to run. I wanted to escape before I said something I'd regret, before I revealed just how much I'd allowed myself to care. But he turned to me then, his eyes dark and intense, his voice low, deliberate. She's no one. You're the one I want. Every fiber of me ached to believe him. To trust him. To let myself fall entirely, without reservation, without fear. I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to tell him I was here, I was real, I was willing to risk everything for this strange, dangerous pull between us. And yet, just as the moment seemed to stretch into something infinite, reality slammed back in. His phone buzzed. A new message, bright and insistent, lighting up the dashboard. He glanced at it quickly, a flicker of tension crossing his face. I saw it in a heartbeat, the way his fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the device, the shadow in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I couldn't help it. I leaned forward, voice tight, trembling. Who? He swallowed hard, jaw tight, eyes avoiding mine for the first time that night. My ex, he said, voice low, tight. She's unstable. I didn't want to scare you. My stomach sank. Every inch of warmth in my chest froze. My mind raced. Unstable? How unstable? Why didn't he tell me sooner? What does this mean? Fear mixed with longing, twisting me into a knot I couldn't untangle. So I'm just another problem? I asked, almost trembling. The words felt foolish coming out of my mouth, but I needed to know. I needed the truth. My heart hurt in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of being caught in someone else's chaos. No, he said, voice cracking slightly, a sound that should have broken me but instead made my chest ache in a different way. You're the only thing that makes me breathe. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let go of everything, fear, doubt, hesitation, and fall into him entirely. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not when the world outside that car was unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of destroying both of us in ways I wasn't ready to face. I stepped out that night, rain-soaked, shivering, heart aching, unable to face him, unable to navigate the chaos that came with loving someone whose life was breaking apart. My coat clung to me, wet and heavy, mirroring the weight of every unspoken word and every uncertain feeling pressing down on me. I walked away, but I couldn't stop turning my head, couldn't stop longing for the warmth I had just walked out of. Every step was agony. Every breath was a reminder of what I had, a connection, a pull, a fragile spark that felt more vital than air. I tried to convince myself I was doing the right thing, that this distance was necessary, that survival meant protecting my heart even if it ached to pieces. But I couldn't lie to myself. I had already fallen, in ways I couldn't untangle or undo, and that realization was more terrifying than anything else. Rain plastered my hair to my forehead, soaked my jeans, ran down my neck. I could feel every drop, every shiver, as if the storm around me was echoing the storm inside me. And yet, despite the fear, despite the chaos, despite the uncertainty, I knew, deep down, I would come back. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew. Because he had already claimed a piece of me I couldn't give up. Even if loving him meant stepping into danger. Even if it meant heartbreak. Even if it meant losing control. And so, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I walked away, but the memory of him, of the warmth in his voice, of the way his eyes followed mine, stayed with me, haunting every step, every thought, every heartbeat. Weeks passed. I tried to convince myself I was better off alone, repeating it over and over like a mantra in my head, "You're safer alone. You don't need this. You can survive without him." I told myself that as I curled up on the couch, staring at the muted city outside my window, the glow of streetlights washing over the empty apartment like a spotlight on my loneliness. I tried to bury the ache in my chest with work, with errands, with late-night phone scrolling, anything to distract myself. But it didn't work. Every evening, without fail, I missed him. I missed the gentle hum of his car as it drove through the slick streets, tires whispering over wet asphalt. I missed the way the warmth of his voice felt like it could wrap around me, soft and unassuming, yet steady enough to calm every jittering nerve in my body. I missed the quiet space I had come to rely on, a fragile, secret world that only existed when he was near, a bubble where no one judged me, where nothing had to be perfect, where I could just be. And every night, I found myself thinking about him. What he was doing. Whether he was thinking about me too. Whether he remembered the way my hands trembled the last time I was in his car, or the way my heart had raced when he had said my name softly, just enough for it to feel like an anchor. I tried to ignore it, to shove it down deep, but it came back the same way every time, a slow, insistent pull at my chest, a quiet whisper that I couldn't silence. Then, one rainy night, it happened. I was walking home, umbrella clutched tightly in one hand, the other shoved in my coat pocket, rain dripping down my collar, seeping into my clothes. The streets were nearly empty, just me and the occasional passing car, the city blurred in halos of light and reflection. My thoughts were tangled, chaotic, spinning around him, around us, around everything I had tried to deny. Headlights appeared behind me, cutting through the wet haze. My pulse spiked. I didn't recognize the car at first, but as it slowed and pulled up beside me, the world seemed to still for a heartbeat. His window rolled down, and I saw him, soaked by the rain, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes locking onto mine like he had been searching for air and finally found it. "I fixed everything," he said softly, voice carrying over the rain and the quiet of the street. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the kind of calm that made your heart lurch. The police got involved. She's gone. My brother's safe. My life is finally mine again. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I just stared at him, rain running down his face, droplets clinging to the edges of his lashes and curling along his jawline. He stepped out slowly, water soaking through his shirt, clinging to his chest and shoulders. Every movement felt deliberate, measured, like he was aware of the way I was watching, like he could see every shard of my hesitation and fear. "I don't want to be your driver anymore," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low, resonant, carrying across the small distance between us. "I want to be the person you come home to." My breath caught. The world seemed impossibly loud, the rain, the distant traffic, even the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I froze, unsure whether to move or run, to scream or cry, to believe him or to protect myself from being hurt again. Then he reached for me, brushing the wet strands of hair from my face, and every wall I had built around myself, every rule I had made to survive, began to crumble. His fingers were warm, steady, and yet there was a tremor, just enough to show me that he was human, that he had vulnerabilities too, that he wasn't perfect, but he was here, entirely, for me. "I became your safe place," he whispered, voice so close it made my knees weak. "But you became my reason to heal." It was the kind of words that makes you believe in the impossible. The kind of words that leave you trembling because you realize the depth of what's been said, the truth behind it, the vulnerability in admitting it. I felt tears sting my eyes, hot and relentless, as the rain plastered my hair and soaked my coat. I didn't care. I couldn't care. I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his body and the sincerity in his words melt all the layers of armor I had built to survive the world alone. I let myself feel the fear, the longing, the relief, the desperate craving I had tried to deny for weeks. And for the first time in a long time, I felt what it was like to be truly safe. Not because he had saved me, not because the world outside had changed, but because together, we had found something far more fragile and far more powerful than protection alone. We had found home. The rain pattered against us, soaking through our clothes, mixing with the tears I hadn't realized were falling. The cold seeped into my skin, but I didn't care. I didn't notice the shivering, the ache, the chaos of the storm outside. All I could feel was him, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, the warmth of his hands holding me gently, and the quiet certainty that this, whatever this was ours. And I realized then, in the blur of wet streets, in the hush of the city, in the heartbeat of the night, that everything I had feared losing, the comfort, the safety, the quiet understanding, was already here. Right in front of me. Right in the steady, wet, perfect chaos of him. I could feel every drop of rain, every shiver, every tremor in my chest as I clung to him, as if letting go would mean losing not just him, but the part of myself I had entrusted to him. And in that moment, time itself seemed to pause, the hum of the city fading into a soft, muted echo, the raindrops suspended midair, and the world reduced to just us, just this fragile, fragile bond that neither of us wanted to break. I whispered his name, almost afraid it would shatter the magic, almost afraid that saying it aloud would make it vanish like smoke. And he held me tighter, brushing my hair back, his lips brushing my temple in the most delicate of gestures, and I felt the kind of warmth that was both terrifying and safe. That was the paradox of him. He was my refuge, and yet he set my heart ablaze in ways I didn't know I could survive. Every instinct in me screamed that I should pull away, that the world outside would interfere, that chaos would follow. And yet, I didn't. Because I had already learned that some things, some people, were worth every risk, every tremor, every ounce of fear. That night, my Uber driver stopped being a stranger. He became the home I didn't know I was searching for. But as I leaned into him, soaked and trembling and alive in the rain, I knew that even in this perfect, fragile moment, the world outside our bubble was still waiting. Waiting to test us, to challenge us, to threaten the fragile peace we had found. And that knowledge made every heartbeat, every shiver, every drop of rain against our skin feel sharper, more urgent, more alive. I didn't care. Not tonight. Not when I had him. Not when, for the first time, I was finally, undeniably, utterly safe.